Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to go over and review all three of the original novelizations for the Indiana Jones trilogy. The art of the film novelization, unfortunately, is really a lost art and something I'm quite fond of, given the fact that I now have quite a substantial film novelization collection. Now, all three of these were originally done as part of the merchandising campaign for all three films, and each one has not only a different author, but a slightly different approach. None of them differ greatly from their films in terms of the stories taking an abrupt left turn or the authors taking it upon themselves to significantly alter things or add things to the film narratives. That's something that you can run into sometimes with really great novelizations and sometimes not so good ones where the authors just did whatever or the publishers had a different idea of what the book should be in comparison to the films. However, I think all three indie novelizations are not only great to read for fans of the films and fans of novelizations, but I think they add so much to the individual films and in certain instances answer a few questions and things that are left unanswered in the films. I think all three of these rank among the best or the higher top tier of film novelizations, and in particular, I think two of them are absolute must-reads, but all three are must-reads for indie fans. So to talk about each of these, I did reread these for actually the first time in quite a while, and I definitely enjoyed coming back to these, but I also took some notes about the overall differences and how the books feel in terms of their tone, so I'm going to refer back to these and give a slight review of each of the three novelizations, and then talk a little bit about the printings. And these have been reprinted many times, so you may have these original paperbacks, or you may have a collection because these have been collected in various trilogies and hardcovers and different things over the years. So to talk first about Raiders, the novelization for Raiders of the Lost Ark, originally written and published in 1981 to tie in with the film, was written by Campbell Black, who didn't typically do works like this, and it's thought to be this was more of a job for hire for him. This is very much in keeping with the sort of darker flavor that is part of the original conception of Indy, and something that apparently seems to have been a flavor that was in more of the original Lawrence Kasdan script drafts and kind of got diluted and worked into other elements over the course of the evolution of the screenplay and, of course, the making of the film. Spielberg also was very big on trying to keep some of the darker elements of Indy. His conception visually was always much more in line with the character of Fred C. Dobbs, the Humphrey Bogart character in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. That this would be a rougher character at times, and he would have the stubble on his face and the sweat and the bruises and all the wear and tear, essentially, that he was not always a perfectly clean-cut hero. You do get quite a bit of this flavor in this novelization, along with certain elements that were in earlier Kasdan script drafts that we don't quite see in the film. So this is one of those novelizations where you definitely get a different flavor, and some characters and instances are very different to what we see in the film. However, the overall plot is the same. Now, this is a much darker tone to Raiders than even what we get in the film. Raiders has the grittiest tone of the original trilogy, and since it was the first film, that kind of makes sense. And over time, this element developed and went different ways, but it was never as inherent as it is in Raiders. Well, that goes into overdrive in the novelization. So if you've ever read any of the earlier Kasdan drafts of the script that are floating around online, that sort of flavor is definitely here. And this absolutely turns up in the characterizations, which are much more nuanced. It picks up on things that you see in the film, but Indy himself is a much rougher character. We also get far more details about the individual characters, their back histories, and there are a couple of additional scenes and sequences that are some are scenes that were actually shot for the film and deleted, but then others seem to have been invented for this or were drawn from, again, previous drafts of the script. So pretty much everybody, in terms of the characters, get a bit more grounding, get a bit more fleshed out, and are definitely darker and more realistic in ways than even what we see in the film. Now, Indy himself, in terms of his characterization, This is stuff that Harrison Ford picks up on in his performance, but the way Indy comes across in this novelization, he's a bit jokier in places, but it's always very darkly tinged, ironic humor. He actually does seem a bit tougher in terms of he's not quite as overtly sensitive, and also we get more of the subplot that was deleted from the film about how Indy not only is lusted after by the lovely girls in the college classroom, but occasionally he does have flings with some of his students. This was part of a deleted subplot that was actually shot for the film, and with it being maintained here, it does again give a different sort of reading of Indy's character in ways, and it ties in with this being a very much more tough and darker characterization that kind of fits in more with this darker look of Indy. I myself have always been actually kind of happy they took that out of the film, because I do think that kind of doesn't really mesh well with Ford's characterization and what we see in the film. However, I don't mind it being here in the novelization, because this is a darker and rougher Indy, and that kind of falls in line more with especially what we get in the earlier Kasdan scripts. So this is something that actually I think reflects stuff that was lost over the process of adapting the film, and then during the shooting, where Kasdan has said at various times that there was stuff that he put in there that didn't quite translate or make it over into the film, because it didn't necessarily mesh up with what Spielberg was going after and what George Lucas was going after. But it's all within the same wheelhouse. But I think basically what you get in this novelization is a different viewpoint of Indy, and this combined with all the extra little bits of detail in the sequences, this is sort of an alternate universe Raiders. It's the Raiders you know and love, but it has so many little tweaks and differences, and some of the characters are a little bit differently rendered, that if you're looking for a fresher experience with Raiders, this is the perfect choice. So Indy himself is a bit darker, and this comes across right in the opening, because we still open in the Peruvian jungles going after the idol, but there's a lot more detail, and we get some nice history leading up to that point. How Indy got there, how the map segment was discovered that put him on the pursuit, and following in the steps of Forrestal. We even get a little bit more about the character of Forrestal. We get more about the character of Satipo, and the actual bits of business inside the temple are a little bit more developed. It doesn't have to go at such a breakneck pace like the film does, because it's not having to worry about a 2-hour runtime. So you get that benefit of a novelization as well. So from the opening forward, you can tell every sequence is definitely a bit more developed, has a little bit more breathing room, and because you've got Indy's internal monologue, that's also fascinating. The character of Belloc is also a bit more developed. We get bits of his internal monologue, and we get more setup, because we get to see how Colonel Dietrich is put in charge of the mission of recovering the Ark of the Covenant, and how he has to begrudgingly partner with Belloc, and they have to locate him. And rather interestingly, we get this whole additional little sequence of all this being put together, and Dietrich wanting to be a good soldier, but not really believing in any of this, and having to bring in Belloc. And then essentially there's an extra little bit where they have continual back and forth, and they have their differing viewpoints that we get a little bit of in the film, but this is something that is actually repeated throughout the novelization and built up further. So as with every character, Dietrich himself has more development than what we get in the film. However, the film does give us enough to understand who this character is and how his viewpoints are completely opposite to Belloc. Now, of these characters, I think Belloc is the one that, honestly, the changes made for the film version and the way that Paul Freeman portrays Belloc, that sort of added touch of the a sort of wiliness, but a sort of all-knowing quality. There's a humor to him as well that is very much reminiscent of Claude Rains, particularly as Captain Renault in Casablanca, which is, I think, the quality we all love in Belloc, and why he's such a great villain, that he sort of straddles all the fences and has fingers in every pie, and does so with a sort of winking acknowledgement. So he has a particular style and charm. Well, Belloc in the novelization, you don't really get that as much. He's a colder character, but on the flip side of that, you also have backstory, which he thinks of and Indy thinks of as well. So you actually learn the past history and the rivalry that developed between Indy and Belloc. So, like everything else in this novelization, things we wonder about in the film are actually shaded in. You know, all the areas are colored in. Imagine it's like a coloring book, and there are just parts that were never colored in fully by the film. Well, those are in the novelization. So again, I think this is kind of reflective of some of the earlier iterations of Belloc and the cast and script drafts. So that's pretty much a natural progression. But I do think of all the characters and things in the film, the one that is enhanced most by the changes made for the film and the performance is actually Belloc, because in the novelization, you don't get that same sort of wonderful twinkle in the eye. In terms of the character that benefits the most, it's Marion Ravenwood, 100%. We all love Marion in the film, and she's wonderfully gutsy and two-fisted and feisty, and we love that. But Marion here in the novelization is even more feisty and two-fisted and gutsy and adorable. But all the interactions with Indy are even more fleshed out. We get more of the backstory, we get more of their past, and of course, having the benefit of it being a novel, you get wonderful internal character monologues. But basically, every scene between Indy and Marion is more nuanced in the novelization, and the time for their feelings to come to the surface and how they're having to constantly interact is a lot more breathing room. We actually have some additional little moments that, while they're small, they're just so wonderfully done. Particularly, there's a moment where once they get to Egypt and they meet up with Salah, and they wind up having a moment with each other in the middle of the night in Salah's house, and they sort of acknowledge their past, and it's a wonderful little scene. And like with every additional bit in this novelization, you can actually picture it. You can picture the scene in the film that doesn't exist, and it's just wonderful for both the characters of Indy and Marion. So for me, the single greatest improvement or unique factor of the novelization is the overall strengthening of Marion as a character, just in her interactions and things. And you wish this stuff was in the film. Like it's there. It's part of the character we know and love from the film, and this is stuff that Karen Allen is doing in her performance, but we get more of that in the novelization. And this is stuff that seems to have also been in the Kasdan drafts that it kind of got diluted in terms of jumping into the film. And this is something that I also think pops up in Temple of Doom with Willie Scott, who is a character that I think is underrated, but everybody likes to compare her unfavorably to Marion. But a lot of this stuff is also there in Temple of Doom in terms of how the character has a bit more grit and much more nuance and an even greater character arc in the script drafts and the novelization as to what we see in the film. Now, one element that's here in the novelization that is definitely a bit weird and is really the one thing I don't like about this is in regards to the characters Marion and Belloc. In the film, we get the famous scene of the drinking game between them in the Cairo Dig tent when she tries to escape. This, of course, harkens back to her introduction in the drinking game in the Raven Bar. But here we don't get that, and instead Belloc tries to seduce Marion, and it's very strongly written that she is at least somewhat swayed by Belloc's affections, and that this, for the rest of the story, kind of plays in the back of her mind every time she has to be in the same room with Belloc. And, you know, it's fine, I guess, but it just feels a bit weird, and given all the situations and events that have happened leading up to this point, it just felt definitely weird for Marion to feel so strongly about Belloc and him essentially trying to put the moves on her. So that's definitely the one element that feels a bit weird. In terms of anything else that doesn't quite work, there is a certain point here where it's really the second half, the real third act of the film, especially. But from the truck chase onward, it seems like the book really pours on the pacing, and we kind of just rush through a lot more. The truck chase is very perfunctory, it's very streamlined. We don't get all of the developments we get in the film, and then the whole climax is, you know, when you get to the truck chase, we don't have many more pages to go, and then all of a sudden we're suddenly at the ending. We do get all of the additional material of how Indy lashes his whip to the conning tower of the submarine and barely survives on his way to basically being towed to the island. So that, of course, was shot for the film and removed. So we get the sort of nitty gritty of how that would work, and how Indy was fighting off drowning and passing out the whole time. But there is definitely a sense of less development and less bells and whistles on all the scenes as what we get in the first half, because we even get additional materials. There's additional dialogue and bits of business when Brody comes to tell Indy that the Army intelligence wants him to go after the Ark, and we actually see that Indy was hanging out with the college student who appeared earlier, which was a scene shot for the film and removed. So basically, they have to just go into another room and not acknowledge that the Indy keeps some interesting after business hours. But in perhaps the most striking moment of the book, where it's just completely new, is that we don't just go straight to Nepal. Indy has to follow the trail in terms of he has to actually look at things to figure out where he's going to go. He doesn't just immediately go, oh, well, Abner Raven was last heard of in Nepal, let me just go there. So he has to actually discuss this with Brody. They essentially talk it out loud for a minute, and then Indy flies to a certain location, and then we get an additional entire sequence where he meets up with an old friend, and who basically gives him an old beater car, and then Indy has to drive all the way to the city where the Raven Bar is in the middle of nowhere. And the whole time he's being tailed further by enemy agents, just like we see the German agent on the plane. Another interesting little tiny tidbit is the agent on the plane, who of course is the Dennis Muren cameo in the film, is actually Tote here in the novelization. So Tote follows Indy on the Clipper, and then Tote shows up at the Raven Bar. We also get some additional bits of business where Indy has to get into the town, and then, of course, when the Raven burns down, and Marion begrudgingly is now tagging along with Indy because she wants her $5,000, God damn it. There's a nice little extra bit where they're driving back in this old clunker car on these snowy, frostbitten mountain winding roads, and they talk about their past a bit further. So, as with a lot of their scenes and dialogue, but particularly in these nice little small additional bits, there's a greater sense of camaraderie and that shared collective past. And these are the moments that are the richest and the most rewarding for Indy fans. So I do think this is an outstanding novelization, even though it does take some differences in terms of comparing with the film, and I do think the second half of the book moves at a more accelerated pace, and you don't quite get as many of the wonderful little bells and whistles as you do in the first half. But it is an enriching experience. It will enrich your vision of the film. It does enrich all of the characters, and it does make the actual film narrative feel more lived in, because the overall tone is much more gritty. So I think this is, again, it is a phenomenal novelization, and it manages to make its own version of the film story that is separate and unique from the film, even though it is telling the same story. So I think it's one of the rare novelizations that does that. And it really is just a phenomenal, fast read that is very engaging and filled with so many little differences that it will keep even the most diehard Indy fan and somebody who knows Raiders like the back of their hand invested, because there's all these extra little bits of business. This goes all the way to the film's ending, which here in the novelization even is a little bit different. There's an extra tag with Marion, like what we see in the film, but it's even more nuanced, even more character driven, and this apparently was in earlier Kasdan drafts, and very much puts a more fitting end to the deeper and better felt relationship between the novelization Indy and Marion. And again, as much as I love and adore Marion in the film, as soon as you start reading this novelization and this version of Marion shows up, you love her even more. So I think the greatest advancement and the greatest strength of the novelization is the deeper felt relationship between Indy and Marion and the deeper characterization of Marion in the novelization. And again, this seems to go back to the stronger sense of character that was in the earlier Lawrence Kasdan drafts of the script. And if you needed a greater example of the sort of fun bells and whistles that are here on it's even scenes that are iconic that you know and are the same here, and the very ending when we have the famous moment of the crate being taken into the warehouse, we have the old watchman pushing the cart, and the novelization takes the time to put the extra little sentence, the grace note of the old guy just feels like maybe he needs his hearing checked because he swears he hears this strange humming sound. And that is just a glorious little grace note to even a scene we know and love that just adds so much to that moment. And that is, I think, perfectly representative of how this novelization plays out. So here is the Ballantine Books paperback edition. This is the original edition. It's also been published with the same cover design, except they went for the original Richard Amsel poster. But I really prefer this because while it's not an action moment, it is a beautiful scene from Indy and Marion's first meeting. And since their relationship is the highlight of the novelization, I think it's perfect and fitting to have on the cover. Now, this doesn't have any photos from the film, but it is nicely done, and it has a nice gloss finish, and this copy is still in really nice shape, so that's why I've never gotten a different one, because this is how I've always read this, and I love having this because it's also done in the style that is matched by the other three paperbacks. So they all go together on the shelf with matching spines, even though they were done across a whole decade. Somebody took the time to say, hey, let's make sure even Last Crusade follows the design of our Raiders paperback. Then we come to Temple of Doom, which was done for the film's 1984 release and marketing campaign. This was written by James Kahn and based on the screenplay by Willard Hayek and Gloria Katz. Just like Raiders, this does have all of, or at least most of the deleted bits that we know of and have seen glimpses of in terms of various disc releases of the film and script excerpts and images and things. But it also takes the time to deeply enrich the characterizations of our lead characters, especially. We also get additional little bits of business that seem to have come from earlier script drafts. We do have a good number of questions answered that people have wondered about over the years. So if there's particular little like gaps in the narrative or things you may have wondered about, those are all pretty much answered here in the novelization. And once again, like Raiders, I think in particular the female love interest of Willie Scott, like Marion, is strongly, really enriched by the additional bits of character nuance and having the internal monologue, in addition to bits that were not included in the film and shot, or bits that were just dropped and never shot. So I think for those who have always felt that Willie was a problematic character or found her annoying, I think reading this novelization will go a long way to helping you see that she does have a definite character arc, and she does have times where she kind of lets her hair down and stops screaming so much and kind of acknowledges that she can be a pain to be around at times. We get some of this in the film, and it is there, but it is not as deeply felt and nuanced because the film moves at such a quick pace and doesn't have the additional bits of material that are in the novelization. The other thing is this book gives you plenty of short round that is not in the film, and if anything is to be commended in this, it is Short Round's internal monologue and the additional sequences. Pretty much the entire second chapter of this is from Short Round's perspective, and basically what he did that day leading up to sitting outside Club Obi-Wan with the stolen car. So we get to see him go to the airport and book the passage with R. Weber and act as Indy's business associate. We get to see Short Round navigate the world and the city and how he lives his life essentially when he's not hanging out with Indy. And also because this is a 1930s pulp adventure, and James Caan has taken the time to pepper the text full of 1930s pulp references and classic Hollywood references, basically 30s pop cultures throughout this, and he does this by putting it in Short Round's internal monologue. So basically Short Round learned English and learned about America through what else? Movies, pop culture, radio shows, and pulp magazines. So he is completely obsessed with Hollywood films, pulp characters, heroes, and references these because that's his frame of reference throughout his internal monologue, in addition to his own particular version of essentially of a religion. He has a certain sort of passing understanding of different religions and different gods, and of course, and also Chinese folklore. So he's constantly in the internal monologue, rather amusingly, it has a sort of child's melding of all these different elements. So he'll do things for luck, like he'll cross himself or do something and think, oh, that's for the god of such and such, or something happens and it makes him, suddenly wish that he was that the shadow was there, because the shadow knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. And there's references to Doc Savage, and there's references to so many classic Hollywood films. But the really lovely bit of business is right there in chapter 2, where Shorty winds up breaking into he sneaks into a theater, and that's how he sees all these movies. And it's of course a Chinese theater showing Hollywood movies. And then rather amusingly, he winds up slipping out and trying not to get caught, and he's of course picked somebody's pocket and done all this stuff, but he strolls out and starts talking to a prostitute, imagining that he's basically imitating Nick Charles, because they had been showing The Thin Man, and he liked that movie because it had the dog and the couple who were always having fun with each other. So there you have Short Round imitating William Powell talking to a prostitute. It's just so gloriously pulpy and bizarre that, oh gosh, you wish it was in the film. So he does this for the entire book. So everything is then peppered and infused with this particularly glorious view of the world that Shorty has. So we get the idea that Shorty has a particularly wonderful childlike view of the world that is completely influenced by his basically upbringing on the streets and running into Indy. But here in the novelization, it is fully fleshed out. So while Indy's a bit grittier, like he is in the Raiders novelization, and we get the deleted scenes, and we get additional bits of business, and some of the gaps in the narrative are answered, and Willie Scott is more textured and nuanced. The great aspect of the Temple of Doom novelization is Short Round's internal monologue, which is glorious and worth reading this book for 100%. If you don't get anything else out of this book, you will absolutely adore Shorty's internal monologue. And for all of us Short Round fans out there who haven't, if you've not read the Temple of Doom novelization, you are missing out, because this is such an incredibly fun read that enriches the film and gives us all the bits of deleted material, and honestly makes the narrative flow better. And it allows you to see that there were probably some things that should have been kept in. So we get the additional bit where Willie escapes and goes back up and runs into Chaterlaw and Captain Blumbert and tries to explain the horrors they've witnessed in the temple. And then Indy shows back up, but he's already under the influence of the Kali Ma. And we get that whole deleted deleted a segment that was removed for time and pacing, but did have some bits of character. We also get to see what they actually experience in the Kali Ma. We get Indy's internal monologue, and that is really fascinating. They probably couldn't have pulled it off cinematically, but it's very wonderfully visual in terms of how Kahn writes this. So that's another really striking moment that's very important. We also get some additional bit of characterization of both Chatar Lal and the Maharaja, in addition to Mola Ram himself. So if you've always felt the actual villain forces were not as textured as what you get in Raiders, well, you get some more texturing here in the novelization that's not quite there in the film, but you can definitely still feel it. But I think the biggest difference you'll note is the additional character nuance and especially in the journey sequence to Pankot Palace between our lead trio, which helps you come to like and appreciate Willie Scott all the more. But also the inclusion of the pieces that were deleted, particularly from the final act of the film, do help things make a bit more sense and flow a little bit better, especially having the scene back of getting the children out of the mines by putting the sort of makeshift bridge over the lava pit in the temple itself. And then that explains how we get to the minecart sequence, because the bridge actually dissipates from the lava flames, and once the last kid gets over, essentially it goes up, and that leaves Indy, Willie, and Shorty stranded, which is why they go back into the mine, and that leads to the minecart scene. So that was shot for the film and removed for time, but that's probably the one thing that should have probably been left, because it helps things flow a little bit better. So that's another real benefit of this novelization. So for me, I do think this is probably the best of the three novelizations overall. I adore the Raiders novelization. I think it's outstanding, but it does kind of speed through the final act a little bit, and I do sorely miss the film characterization of Belloc. But Temple of Doom doesn't have any issues whatsoever, and I think the real grace note is James Caan's peppering with 30s references in Shorty's internal monologue. And the internal monologue for our three characters is so rich and textured and detailed, and so enriches the film that you can't divorce it from how you see the film from this point forward. So this is another novelization that will only enrich your vision of the film, and especially if you're not a fan of Willie, if you read this novelization, I think you might change your mind a bit, or at least see her in a more positive light as a character. But every bit of additional business here is wonderful, and it's topped off by a beautiful usage of classic 1930s pulp references and Hollywood references throughout in Shorty's internal monologue. So as in Raiders, the growth in the relationship between Indy and the leading lady here in Willie Scott is significantly more developed and more felt than even what we have in the film. It's basically a further realization of what we get in the film. But the addition of having Shorty even more developed, and the three forming a sort of unlikely family unit, which again we have in the film, but it's not as deeply felt because it's not backed with all of this additional material. This basically multiplies and increases the enhancement of these characters than what we get in Raiders, because we're just talking about two. Now we're talking about three characters, and you don't have the issue of the second half of the story feeling a bit more sped up in terms of feeling a bit, maybe a little rushed through in certain places. But not only do I think is this the best of the three novelizations, but while I like the improvements in Raiders, I wouldn't necessarily call the novelization better than the film. I think it just enhances it. And I think Temple is a masterpiece, but the novelization enriches it so much and has so much more to it that in ways I do think the novelization is better than the film, because you're just getting more of what we love in the film, but it's better textured, a bit more grounded in places, and you have the deleted material that we didn't get in the film that helps smooth over some of the very slight narrative gaps here and there that are noticeable if you look really, really closely, or if that kind of stuff bothers you. So Because of these things, the novelization is actually kind of better, and it's topped off by, again, the internal monologue. And for people like myself who are diehard fans of Pulp Fiction and classic Hollywood, the constant references Shorty makes are just beautiful. So, of the three, I think this is the strongest and the best of the novelizations. So here we have the original 1984 printing, which uses the gorgeous Drew Struzan teaser artwork poster. And of course, it has the matching spine and rear to Raiders. This did have the original gloss finish. You can still see it still has some of that, but of course this is the copy I've always had, and it's a little bit more worn than my Raiders copy, but still in really good shape. Usually you find these and they're pretty trashed because they've been read so many times. But rather nicely, this does actually include a photo section in the middle, which is in color. So this has the lovely old-fashioned photo insert middle that we come to expect in books of this nature from this time period. And these have retained all their luster because they were printed on nice, glossy photo type paper. And of course, they have the nice captions on them as well. And then we turn to the novelization for The Last Crusade, which was written by Rob MacGregor. And the success of this, or I guess because he was the Indy author of record, is what led to just a little while later, starting in 1991, his writing of the Indiana Jones novels, which started the Indy novel series. And you can draw a lot of parallels between his Last Crusade novelization and his writing of Indiana Jones and the Peril at Delphi in 1991 in terms of his characterization of Indy, his writing style is very much linked to what you see in the Last Crusade novelization. So if you like what you see here in this novelization, that's what turns up in his first Indy standalone novel. So this, of course, again, like the previous two, follows the events of the film, doesn't deviate a whole lot. It does have the deleted scenes we've heard of and read about and seen stills of or seen glimpses of, along with one or two extra bits of business which may have been part of earlier drafts or invented by the author. But the real gold to mine in this is, once again, the character in the internal monologue. In particular, you get most of that from Indy here, and I think MacGregor's greatest strength with Indy is getting to the core values of his character and really strengthening and using those as a foundation for everything else. So it's the internal dialogue that Indy has with himself that's the richest thing in this particular novelization, and it does serve to further define the difficult relationship he's had with his father throughout his whole life. So we do get the opening we see in the film of the sort of young Indy sequence, but it is a bit more developed and has a little bit more to the action staging and the set piece of using the circus train than what we see in the film. So very nicely, the book takes the liberty of sort of jazzing up the sequence and making it a bit more involving and a bit less kind of a little bit less on the nose in terms of how the film sort of presents all of these defining characteristics of Indiana Jones happened in one particular moment on one particular afternoon, kind of within, an hour. And also it helps because the novel develops this action sequence a bit more. It's not so perfunctory, essentially. And then when Indy gets back home and tries to tell his dad of what's happened, even that moment is a little bit more built up and developed, and it shows a greater degree of the animosity that's already there between them. And this is further heightened by having Indy's internal monologue. So again, I think MacGregor's handle on Indy's internal discourse, the discussions he's always having with himself, I think he has a great handle on Indy's character, and this is what you see maintained in his Indy novels. So we, again, pretty much see the events of the film play out as they happen. Some little differences in characterization pop up in terms of what we see from the supporting characters. Particularly an issue of mine has always been that in the film, both Brody and Sala are a little bit played more for laughs. They do have a bit more of an element of a buffoonery to their characters, which wasn't there in Raiders. That does seem to be toned down quite a bit here, or it's just not as apparent. So if you're like me and you never quite liked that more comedic effect their characters had in the film, that's not here, thankfully. We do get all the wonderful father-son banter and sort of bridge being built in their relationship between Henry Sr. and Indiana. So that, of course, is everyone's favorite part of Last Crusade. That's here, but it is defined a little bit differently. It's not quite the same dynamic because, of course, you don't have Ford and Sean Connery playing off of each other, but also it's developed a little bit differently. And in the course of their dialogue, we get extra little snippets of the backstory that we don't get in the film. There is a little bit more discussion of Indy's mother, and in terms of she's actually named, and there's a little bit more specific concrete details about all these intervening years between the opening prologue of the film and where we are in 1939 in the Last Crusade story itself. So that's fascinating for fans of the film and Indy fans. So if you've always wanted to have at least a little bit more glimpse into what all the backstory is, you get a little bit of that here, but you also don't have 100% of the iconic moments. So this is probably, it seems to have been based on maybe just a slightly earlier draft of the script, or again, there were last-minute rewrites by Tom Stoppard, who was uncredited, and there was also the Writers Guild strike in 1988, which affected the film. And then, of course, you have on-set things, and you have on-set discoveries and building scenes and all of Sean Connery's input. So these things, of course, developed over time. But of these three novelizations, you will notice that here in Last Crusade, some of the most memorable particular lines of dialogue are simply not here, and that simply seems to be because they were developed later or during the making of the film. Also, you see the addition of more degrees of nuance to Elsa's character. The character of Elsa is probably... I think she's fine as a character, but she's so ill-defined in The Last Crusade itself. That's always been a big sticking point for me, because you can never exactly tell her motivation. She's a character that's meant to sort of straddle the fence and be playing both sides, but ultimately have her own goal in mind, which we get the idea, but it's never as fully defined as it could be, and it really should be. Thankfully, you get a bit more of that here. It's still not 100% obvious what her ultimate motivation in the climax is, and you do hope you would get a firm answer on that, but I think it is much better stated and set up and established in the novelization, and you get greater degrees of nuance in her character. And to be quite frank, she's a more likable character in the novelization because she displays more humor, more humanity overall, whereas in the film she frequently comes across as much colder and not quite as warm and jovial in places. There is some degree of that, but in the film it's not always easy to understand what the attraction is between her and Indy, simply due to, again, I think she's just not a very well-developed character, and that's nothing against Alison Dewey's performance. I think she does great with what material she's given. It's just a character I always wish was more fully developed, because again, she's a hard character to get a read on, and if you know the film, particularly in the ending sequence inside the Grail room, or the Grail chamber, if you want to call it that, it's her motivations are questionable. So there's a particular point where you start to wonder, okay, did she choose the Grail cup she chose because she legitimately thought that was the Grail itself? Or did she choose that Grail incorrectly on purpose for her own particular reasons? And when you start to think about that, it's kind of hard to know which is the actual answer. When you think about it, it seems like, okay, well, I guess she chose it incorrectly on purpose. But again, there's a question there. And either way, there's no proper establishing, and there's no concrete sense of what her actual motivation was. And then that you could draw that line further, because she's been back and forth on both sides throughout the whole film. It's hard to always tell where exactly her character was at any point in time. In reality, she wasn't on either side. She was on her own side. She was a third player. So while I did appreciate that at least that character had a bit more development and was a bit more likable, which made the turn of the story much more interesting in terms of it was a bit more affecting due to actually liking the character a bit more. It still didn't solve all the issues I have with that character not being as fully developed as the previous two love interests. In terms of the villains, we do get at least a little bit more development on Donovan, but just only in the slightest areas. I still think that is another issue with Last Crusade. I've never been a giant fan of the Donovan character because he's just not super developed, and the fact that you have Julian Glover playing the character in the film, I could never help but think that some of that inspiration for the character and casting Julian Glover was his performance in For Your Eyes Only as a far more developed character, also not even with a whole lot of screen time. So I've always just felt that Donovan was like a very watered down Cristados in that sense. But at least you get just a tiny bit more character development and a little bit of dialogue here and there about his motivation, and he does seem to have a bit more humor and a bit more cunning on display. So basically, I think all the characters here and the plot overall is a bit more detailed, and while we don't have 100% of all the iconic moments, pretty much everything is there, and the real benefit to the novelization is getting Indiana's own internal monologue and having a much deeper insight into his character. There are also one or two rather interesting, or at least there's at least a couple moments of flashback where Indy, in his internal monologue, does flashback to earlier points in his life. So it's not just in the opening, but even, for example, in the ending, when we have the final joining of father and son, Indy even has a flashback there in that moment. So again, that's something you could really only do in novel form, but all of this serves to further enrich Indy's character. There are some notable differences in the climax, particularly the tank chase is a bit more convoluted, it's a bit more developed, there are some additional action beats, and I thought it was very interesting when the tank goes off the cliff and Indy manages to barely survive. There's a particular detail in the novelization where in the process of surviving, he managed to shred his pants. So when he shows back up, he's got a pair of shredded pants. So he's basically not wearing any pants, and he's barely alive. And that's just a particular detail I found so striking. I don't know how it was developed, but he has to basically steal a pair of pants from a dead German soldier after that. But that was still just an interesting, very strange sight. Then we get to the actual finale inside of the temple, and we do see all of the material that was cut from the film in terms of the additional traps and the additional sequences, which go a little bit beyond what we see in the film. Like, of course, the still with Harrison Ford and the giant tarantula crawling on him. That was part of the Word of God sequence originally. So basically, there were some extra bits of business that were removed from the film that are here, and I do think all of the additional material and the way that the actual scenario is handled when they're actually interacting with each other, all the characters, I think it's a bit more developed, and all of this serves to make the climax feel a bit more fitting, because I've always felt the climax of Last Crusade, it's an emotional climax. It's not a set piece climax, because it does seem a bit lesser compared, especially to the two films that preceded it. And it's like, well, we've seen Indy go through traps before, and these traps seem a little bit more simple. They are much more about the ideas behind them. Particularly, that's why the leap of faith has always been, I think, the most effective by far of the three challenges to get to the Grail Room. Then the Grail Knight himself actually has more dialogue and is actually quite humorous, so the actual Grail Knight is more developed and has additional dialogue after the climax has unfolded, which I found really funny and rewarding. So I think Rob MacGregor had a lot of fun writing the Grail Knight. So if you love the Grail Knight and you like to choose wisely, then you'll get a lot of fun out of reading the Grail Knight's tiny little extra bits of adventure. But outside of those moments, it is pretty much what you get in the film. We do also see the deleted bit aboard the Zeppelin earlier on with the World War I flying ace, and the part that would have been the additional screen time for Pat Roach, who unfortunately due to this being cut, he's only barely glimpsed in the film, but we do get that whole sequence in the book, so that way if you always wondered what this was exactly and you've not read the script drafts and you've just seen a photo, you can read it in book form to get an idea of what that deleted sequence would be like. So we do see pretty much all the deleted bits that we know of that was material that was shot. It is here, but overall, when you compare it to the other two, I think this is a really solid and well done novelization. I think from the opening, you can tell that we're getting more into the nitty gritty of the scenarios in the film. So not only is the opening more detailed, even the opening sequence that we seek into after the prologue of Indy on board ship trying to recover the Cross of Coronado from Panama Hat. Well, we even get more about the character of Panama Hat and how Indy got there, and the whole sequence feels more lived in. So that feeling is maintained throughout, and that is, along with Indy's characterization, I think the real draw here. And it makes sense why later on they would choose Rob MacGregor to write the first Indy novel and get that series started. So I do think this is a very well done novelization. It's one I would recommend to anyone. However, it just doesn't quite have the same spice to it, the same sparkle as the first two novelizations, which is it would be hard for any novelization, I think, to achieve that, because when you read through these and you've read a lot of different novelizations, so you've seen how they can all turn out in completely different ways, it becomes, I think, a lot easier to separate the good ones from the bad ones, and also to separate out the great ones from the good or even very good ones. So I would say Last Crusade's novelization is extremely good, and I would recommend it to anyone. However, I do think it is edged out by the Raiders and Temple novelizations, which I would put at the absolute top of the heap in terms of novelizations, alongside some of my all-time favorite books. And as much as I love the Raiders novelization, it does kind of start to peter out towards the end in terms of there's not enough pages. It could have really used like maybe another 5 to 10 pages to, punch up the truck chase a little bit, for example. And you don't have that issue in Temple. So I think all three are excellent and should be read by all fans of the films, and everybody's going to get something out of these, and they are well written and they're very great reads. But of the three, I think Temple of Doom's novelization by James Kahn is the strongest overall, and the one that in the most ways actually kind of outdoes things we even see in the film. So that's how I would sort of rank them if I had to. But they form a nice cohesive trilogy, and they've been collected many times as a trilogy book. So in a lot of ways, they do reflect the novelizations for the original Star Wars trilogy, which are all excellent. They all build upon the films, and they all enrich the film experiences. But one of them kind of just follows more along the lines with just retelling the film itself. One of them takes a lot more risks, and one is sort of in the middle. And I think that these three kind of reflect some of those same things. So it's fitting that both the Star Wars novelizations and the Indiana Jones novelizations are frequently collected and anthologized. But the Last Crusade novelization is excellent in its own right. I would just put it slightly below the first two. And again, that's only slightly. I would, if I had to rate these on a scale, Temple would be a 5 out of 5. Raiders would be like a 4.95 or 4.99 out of 5. It's right up there. And then Last Crusade would be like a 4.5 maybe. I mean, it's also very excellent and far above average for novelizations, but it's just outshone by its predecessors. So here is the original 1989 tie-in paperback, which beautifully uses the Drew Struzan iconic poster, has a nice glossy finish to it, and of course maintains the same design except the spine and rear is in red. So this actually does match the previous two books, which is very surprising given the fact that the films straddle the entire decade of the 80s, and they didn't always do matching book designs like this. So that was a lovely touch, even though it would have been better had this been black like the previous two, but at least all of the typeface and design is the same. Like Temple of Doom, this does contain a photo section in the middle of the book, also on black paper, so it matches the design of the Temple novelization photo layout. Unfortunately, there are no old-fashioned captions to them like we get in Temple, but it just depended on whether or not the publisher decided to include those. So those are my thoughts on the three original novelizations for the Indiana Jones trilogy. There have also been junior novelizations done by different writers, which I presume are based on these. And then again in, I think it was 2007, for the release of Crystal Skull, which myself and most Indy fans agreed we tried to ignore. That Scholastic did do new junior novelizations of the original films, which I haven't read, but I'd like to try them at some point just to see if they're any different. But I would presume they would obviously be, watered down because they're the junior novelizations. But sometimes those can be fun. For most of the ones I've tried are fun, and sometimes they're actually quite good. So you never know if the junior novelizations will be worth your time or not, but I'd like to try this at some point. There is, of course, also a novelization for Crystal Skull, which I have never read, but now that I've gone back and reread the original trilogy novelizations, I am very curious to give it a try. It was written by James Rollins, and I've heard good things about it, and that it does improve upon several of the film's issues, but unfortunately you're going to be stuck with the same story, so I don't know how much it could do, but I'd like to be pleasantly surprised, so I will finally give that a go, and then I'll do a review of it as well when I get my hands on a copy and dive into it. But it's sad that there isn't any novelization I'm aware of for the upcoming Dial of Destiny, so the novelizations are a lost art. It's not something that people do anymore for marketing campaigns. It's not something people really think of, unfortunately, and it's something very near and dear to my heart because I grew up with film novelizations being in bookstores or at newsstands, and I really enjoy them, and I think it's a brilliant way to not only market a film but keep its memory alive and also invest audiences further with the film, because in the pre-video days, it was one of the only ways you could keep a film alive in your memory, and any spurring of the imagination to further think about a film only keeps you interested in said film for even longer. And novelizations really suit Indiana Jones well, so hopefully maybe somebody decides to do a novelization of Dial of Destiny. I don't know if that's something Disney would ever be interested in. They did do at least some novelizations for some of the newer Star Wars films they made, but it would be nice if there was some type of novelization for Dial of Destiny. Whether it turns out to be a good film or not, I don't know, but that it would definitely be nice to see a final novelization for the purported final Indiana Jones film. But in any case, these were simply my thoughts about rereading the original trilogy of novelizations, and I will include my notes of all the differences I noted on this read-through. If you're interested in those, I will include those in the description below if you just want to know more of the nitty-gritty specific differences in terms of events, dialogue, characters, deleted materials, or things that were only in prior drafts of the screenplays. I just didn't want to go into them here because then that would make this video even longer, and I don't like to spoil the experience of people reading these for the first time, because most of the joy of reading a novelization of a film, especially one that you love and adore and know and can just recite blindfolded, is looking for and coming across all these differences and seeing the different nuances in character and reading the internal monologues and seeing what the author can bring to the text of the film's story itself, how you enliven it, how you make it live and breathe on the page as opposed to seeing it in the film you love and adore. So again, I would recommend these to anyone looking for a great novelization or looking for an indie experience on the printed page that you can have a lot of fun with. I hope, as always, my babblings about books and films and film books and movie novelizations has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep reading print books, keep supporting independent local bookstores wherever possible, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.